Well, hello. My name's Adrian Gilbert, and I'd like to welcome you once more to the Invisible College. Now, today's lecture is called The Way to Enlightenment, a Visit to the New Jerusalem. Bit of a mouthful, I'm afraid, but I think you'll soon get the hang of this, and you'll see how this does fit in with the whole series that I'm doing now on self-development, transformation, following the way. Now, you may remember an earlier lecture I did, which was based on the Pilgrim's Progress, the idea of how the Fool in the tarot cards represents the pilgrim, starting off on his journey to enlightenment, journey to going through various experiences. And within the Pilgrim's Way itself, there was a very important moment where the pilgrim comes up to what's called the Wickety Gate. Now, the Wickety Gate symbolises the entrance from the outer world, the world of our day-to-day lives, everything that we're doing, our jobs, our family life, our recreations, all of that, entering through the Wickety Gate into what you could call your spiritual life, or I don't really like that term because it smacks too much of kind of holier than thou, but rather your inner development, your inner transformational life, on whichever path you might be following. It doesn't have to be a Christian path, it doesn't have to be a Buddhist path or a Mohammedan path or any other path particularly. It may be even is your own personal path which nobody has followed before. But anyway, passing through the Wickety Gate symbolises a major transformation on that journey, moving from one level up to a different one. And we're going to investigate that further in this lecture. Now, of course, the pilgrim himself, when he passes through the Wickety Gate, that's not the end of his journey by any means. Where he's trying to get to is what's called the Celestial City, which is a beautiful image, I suppose, of the heavenly resurrected realms, where we would like to get to at the end of our lives even. But there's a more mundane and more prosaic understanding to this as well, which is connected with following the way and finding the core, the higher, the place that from which great knowledge emanates. And within the Bible itself, of course, this ties in very neatly with the teachings about the New Jerusalem. And interestingly, the New Jerusalem itself, it comes to us in the Bible in the last couple of pages. I mean, we've got all this Bible here, right? Starting with the book of Genesis and Adam and Eve and Noah and his ark and Abraham and all of that. We go through Exodus and Numbers and all of the things that happened with the kingdom of Israel and the book of Samuel, Kings. Eventually we come out to the Gospels of Matthew, the whole story of Jesus. We end up with the epistles of St. Paul and other apostles. And at the very end of the book, we come to the last book in the book, which is the Revelation or the Apocalypse. And at the very end of that, in the last couple of chapters, is where we find this whole description of New Jerusalem. And well, this is what it says about the New Jerusalem actually in the Bible. I'm going to read it out to you. So as I say, this is in the chapter 21 of Revelation, the Apocalypse of St. John. And this is what it actually says. And he, that's an angel, carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me the great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, and her light was like unto a stone most precious, even like a jasper stone, clear as crystal, and had a great wall and high, and had 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Of the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city, and the gates thereof, and the wall thereof. And the city lieth foursquare, and the length is as large as the breadth. And he measured the city with the reed, 12,000 furlongs. The length and the breadth and the height of it are equal. And he measured the wall thereof, 144 cubits, according to the measure of a man, that is, of the angel. And the building of the wall of it was of jasper, and the city was pure gold, like unto glass. And the foundation of the wall of the city was garnished with all manner of precious stones. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third a chalcedony, the fourth an emerald, the fifth sardonyx, the sixth sardius, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth a topaz, the 10th a chrysoprase, the 11th a jacinth, the 12th an amethyst. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Every several gate was of 1 pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, as it were transparent glass. And I saw no temple therein, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it. And the city had no need of the sun, neither of the moon to shine in it, for the glory of God did lighten it, and the Lamb is the light thereof. And the nations of them which are saved shall walk in the light of it, and the kings of the earth do bring their glory and honour into it. And the gates of it shall not be shut at all by day, for there shall be no night there. And they shall bring the glory and honour of the nations into it, and there shall in no wise enter into it anything that defileth, neither whatsoever working abomination or making a lie, but they which are written in the Lamb's book of life. So there we have it, a foursquare city as shown to St. John. St. John sees this in a vision, a foursquare city with 12 gates leading into it, and on the top of the gates are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, and each one is guarded, each gateway is guarded by an angel and is made out of a pearl. Take of that what you will. But the whole system, the whole idea of the New Jerusalem ties in very, very closely, I find, with the celestial city that Pilgrim has been instructed to discover. And so I'm going to go into that, not least because of, obviously, Jerusalem itself, not the New Jerusalem, the Old Jerusalem, has always been a major centre of pilgrimage, not just for Christians even, but for Muslims and Jews as well. So we're going to explore this whole idea connected with the New Jerusalem, what this means in terms of our journey, our path to enlightenment, and how we can make use of this knowledge today. So anyway, before we go into that, I want to just put us in perspective with the Old Jerusalem and the Holy Land. The Holy Land itself, I'm sure if you've seen it on the atlas, it's on the east end of the Mediterranean Sea, just a bit above Egypt, and there's this narrow strip of land with Babylonia and Iraq, leading on to Persia towards the east, Mediterranean Sea to the west. We've got Egypt and Africa to the south, and then to the north you've got Syria leading to Turkey and up to Europe and all of that leading up there. So it's very much a kind of crossroads place, and always has been throughout history. So, and crossroads are often dangerous places to live because they're the places where invaders come and go on their way from one place to the other. Even if they don't want to conquer you, particularly, they might not be very interested in you who lives there. They're going to walk through you on their way to somewhere else, whether they're coming from Babylon to Egypt or Egypt going up to attack the Hittites in Turkey. You're going to be in the way. So it's going to have a dramatic history anyway. But something else about this particular place is very interesting, which is that immediately to the east of Jerusalem is this great deep valley cut into the landscape. You've got the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point on Earth. I've been down there, and it's very, very strange. You're well below sea level. But that's not the only place that's below sea level. There's a great valley that runs all the way up, going up to the Sea of Galilee, which is also below sea level, which is where Jesus did a lot of his preaching. But this is no accident that this deep rift is here, because it is actually part of a great rift valley where two plates on the earth are meeting and moving one with respect to the other. You've got the Asian plate and the European plate. And this rift carries on down beyond Israel itself. It cuts down through the Red Sea, which is part of this great rift, and right through East Africa, forming the great rift valley of East Africa. So one of the major fault lines on the Earth's surface, it runs right along through Israel, through Palestine, Holy Land, whichever name you like to give it. And Jerusalem is within 10 miles, 15 miles of this great rift. So that means this city itself is in a kind of earthquake zone, and it's a place where we should be watching to see what happens in terms of earth changes of one sort or another. Anyway, if we look at Israel, we look at Jerusalem, we see where it is, and it's positioned in the Judean hills. So our New Jerusalem is visualized as being a city that's sort of going to be in that place, but not really, because it's actually a heavenly city. But it's linked with the idea of Jerusalem. And it has 12 gateways. And the reason it has 12 gateways is very much connected with the history of Israel itself. And it started, the story actually in Jerusalem begins with none other but the patriarch Abraham, whom all the great traditions, the Jewish, the Islamic, the Christian, they're all looking back to Abraham, this man who was chosen by God, and his descendants became God's people. But Abraham's story really begins in earnest when he believes that he's told that he's got to sacrifice his own son. You can just think for a moment what that means. Am I going mad? Is God telling me that really this son that I love, I've got to take out and I've got to sacrifice him? But he's an obedient sort, is Abraham, so he goes out, he gets his son, and they go up a hill together and they bring firewood, and then he lays his son out, and he's all ready to slay him when an angel comes along and says, hey, hang on, actually God doesn't want you to do that. You've proved your worth, you've proved you obey his commands. Here's a sheep instead, here's a lamb, sacrifice that. Now God's going to work with you and you're his man. And all this takes place on top of Mount Moriah, which is a not that high mount in Jerusalem, actually on the edge of Jerusalem, Old Jerusalem. And this is where it supposedly took place. So we need to look at Abraham and where he was coming from. Abraham, we're told in the Bible, had a wife called Sarah. They made various journeys. They went to Egypt and they came back. And he was having problems Sarah was having problems, she couldn't have children. So instead, she got her maidservant called Hagar to bear her husband a child. And this child's called Ishmael. Later on, Sarah herself becomes pregnant. She's amazed at this. I'm an old woman. How can I be pregnant? Anyway, she has a child called Isaac. Now, Sarah then becomes very jealous of Ishmael and persuades Abraham to throw Hagar out with her son Ishmael from the household, and they're chucked out into the desert. He becomes the patriarch, or the father of the Ishmaelites, which is another name for the Arabs. So all of the Muslims and Arabs, everyone looks back to Ishmael as their patriarch. The Jews, on the other hand, look back to Isaac. So a lot of the problems that are occurring around Israel at present, you could say, date from this situation when Abraham, persuaded by his wife Sarah, chucked out Ishmael and split the family, as it were, and created great enmity between these two half-brothers, Isaac and Ishmael, and their descendants, who are all basically cousins. The Jews and the Muslims are basically cousins. So all of the problems that we see around Jerusalem, the risks and the potential for causing world wars, all, you could say, stems from this. Now, you might also say, well, that's just a myth, it's just a story in the Bible. Maybe, but there's enough people believe that story to make it true in the present. And this is the problem. Anyway, cut a long story short, Isaac then had two sons, one called Esau, and one called Jacob. And Jacob's the one that interests us. He's the one that all the blessings fell upon. And he had 12 sons. And the 12 sons later became the patriarchs themselves of the 12 tribes of Israel. I should add, you probably remember the story in Joseph in his Technicolor Dreamcoat. He's one of the 12 sons that was sold by his elder brothers. Didn't like him, jealous of him. They sold him and he was taken to Egypt, which actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because he then became the Pharaoh's right-hand man. And in that position, he was able to save his own family as well as the Egyptians from terrible famine. Anyway, as a result of that, Jacob, who had changed his name to Israel, adopted Joseph's two sons into his own family. One of those sons, Ephraim, took the place of Joseph, his father. So he becomes, instead of being a grandson, he becomes like a son of Israel, of Jacob. And the other son, Manasseh, takes the place of Levi. Levi no longer is a landholder. He becomes the Levites become the priesthood, and they're distributed around the other tribes. So they maintain the number 12. The number 12 is very important. So this is how they get round the Levites becoming the priesthood. One of Joseph's sons takes his place. So we have our 12 tribes of Israel. And they are then, after the Exodus, they go to Egypt and then they're taken into bondage by the Egyptians, and then Moses leads them out, wander in the desert. Eventually they come back to the promised land. And they conquer the land, and then they split it up, different bits for different tribes. And this is more or less how it was split up. There are slight variations in how people believe this was, but this is sort of more or less the map of how they distributed the land among themselves. And you'll notice here that Jerusalem itself is within the precincts of the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin was the brother of Joseph, the younger brother. And the Benjamites ally themselves closely with Judah, the Judahites, or the Judeans, the Jews, as they become. And later they form a southern kingdom of Israel, because Israel itself becomes split. Most of the tribes go with the northern part, and just these two tribes remain in the southern part. And the Jews, as we know them today, are descended from Judah. So it's true to say that all Jews are Israelites, but it's not true to say that all Israelites are Jews. And this is a common misconception. Many of the tribes of Israel disappeared or were taken into captivity by the Assyrians. We don't know what happened to them after that, for certain. There are traditions in Britain, which I've written about, that they came here, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, returning to our story here. The contended place, Mount Moriah, is where today you will see the Golden Dome of the Rock. Now, I'm going to talk more about that later. This covers over the spot where Abraham is supposed to have been about to sacrifice his son, but instead sacrificed a lamb. And descending, we can put the tribes of Israel, of Jacob's posterity, into this pattern here, distributed round a 12-pointed star. This is very, very important, esoterically speaking, this number 12. We come back to it again and again. 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles of Jesus, 12 months of the year, the 12 members of a jury. It's number 12. It recurs over and over as being kind of like the number of completion, with a 13th standing in the middle. And it is very much connected with the concept of the Zodiac, the 12 signs of the Zodiac. And traditionally, the 12 sons of Israel are each allocated one or another sign of the Zodiac. Now, we're not absolutely certain, or there are different opinions about which tribe goes with which sign, but there's a fair amount of agreement, at least about 4 of them. And nearly always you'll find that Ephraim is given to Taurus. Judah, the lion tribe of Israel, is given to Leo. Dan is given to Scorpio. And Reuben is given to Aquarius. So we have our 12 tribes of Israel with their 4 leading tribes being the 4 fixed signs of the Zodiac. So how does this story of Jacob and his sons and the tribes of Israel that grew from them fit with the story we get at the end of the book of Revelation about this New Jerusalem which comes down from heaven? Well, a powerful insight into this was provided by John Michel, writing a book in 1972 called City of Revelation. John Michel was one of those characters who really changed history. I met him. He was a really great guy, but he had investigated sacred geometry in a way that I don't think anyone had before then. And he had investigated how different dimensions and proportions had been used to develop systems of architecture which are based upon the measures of the solar system. And he put all this together in this remarkable book, City of Revelation, which was a huge eye-opener for all of us, I think, who were interested in esotericism and were living at that time. Anyway, John's central discovery a plan for New Jerusalem based on his analysis of the biblical text, which looks something like this, where you have 12 small circles around an inner circle. You have a square and another circle within that, and a 12-pointed star within that. And he called this diagram the New Jerusalem, but it's basically based on a simpler plan of the squared circle. Now, if you haven't come across this, it is actually the very ancient secret, I suppose you could call it, of how do you square a circle. Squaring a circle refers to producing a square which has the same perimeter as the circle that's drawn round it. And actually that is based upon the number pi and is used in the constructing the ground plan of the Great Pyramid at Giza. So this is something that's been known for a very, very long time, we're talking 5,000 years, and is actually also connected, as I've described or discussed in my book Stone of Destiny, is connected with the Stone of Destiny itself. So anyway, John Michel had been working with this plan, and he devised the New Jerusalem plan based upon it. Now, this is really quite remarkable because the radius of the moon is 1,080 miles, while the radius of the Earth is roughly 3,960 miles, which means that the diameter of the Earth is 7,920 miles. And if you draw a square that contains the Earth, obviously that will have a side which is the same as that diameter, 7,920 miles. So the perimeter of it, of the square, will be 4 times that, which is 31,680 miles. Meanwhile, the radius, if you imagine you put the moon so it's touching the Earth, and draw a line connecting the centre of the Earth to the centre of the moon, and then you draw a circle based on that length, the radius of the circle will be 3,960 plus 1,080, which is 5,040 miles. And the perimeter of that circle will be given by the formula 2 pi r, which is 2 times 22 over 7 times the radius 5040, and that also comes to 31,680 miles. So the relationship of the moon to the Earth is actually the same as you would need to generate the circle that has the same perimeter as the square. A truly remarkable discovery. And I remember talking to John Michel about this. I mean, he's actually passed on now. He died a few years ago, which is a great shame, because he was a great guy. But I talked to him about this, and he said, he regarded the discovery of this relationship between the moon and the Earth and how it created this squaring of the circle as his single most important discovery. And I would go along with that, because it does indicate something which is quite cosmic, and we'll be coming back to the significance of those moons and the Earth later on in this talk. And from that, he was able to draw his diagram of New Jerusalem, where he put 12 of these moons, one on each side, and 3 on each side of the square, all of them with their centres on this circle. And he devised from that his plan of New Jerusalem, which we can see here. And if we put the names of the 12 sons of Israel on those circles, we can begin to see something that definitely does tie in with this city of Revelation. as John put it, if you think about the moon as being a sort of pearl, it says in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, that each gate was made from a pearl. And over each gate was the name of a particular tribe of Israel. So he put the names of the tribes of Israel. And also you can draw within that circle, the positions of all these other circles is determined by a 12-pointed star, which is symbolic of the Zodiac. So we can see how there is this organic relationship between this cosmic city of wisdom, the city of New Jerusalem, and this geometric construct stemming out of the squaring of the circle. Of course, there's much more to it than all that, and I would recommend anyone to go out and read this book. It's absolutely fascinating. But how does that itself tie in with the picture that we have, that I showed you at the beginning, of New Jerusalem? Well, if you examine this picture in detail, what you see is that running from the 12 gates, which are shown here very clearly, you have actually got a series of avenues. You've got 3 which are running in one direction, and 3 avenues running in at right angles to them. And if I lay this out on a plan, so imagine we're looking downwards, you can see here, I've put here the little gates with these kind of blue archways, and you can see you've got a grid plan of 3 running in one direction and 3 the other. You can think north, south, east, west, and a square around there which represents the wall of the city. And within it, if we look at the picture of New Jerusalem, there is kind of a circular area in the middle. So I've drawn that as well to see how this fits in. Now, if we now take this and we lay it onto John Michel's pattern of New Jerusalem, this grid plan, we see something very interesting. That the positioning of the grid actually fits remarkably well with the 12 circles that he's drawn. Each circle is on one or another of those avenues where the gates are. And also the grid plan fits to the 12-pointed star which he drew inside his New Jerusalem construct, and which actually gave him the positions of his circles on the outside. So we can see that the picture that we had of New Jerusalem actually is related to this cosmic map which John Michel had given us in his work based on the squared circle. So the New Jerusalem picture that we were looking at the beginning with the angel showing St. John the New Jerusalem as the city that's come down from heaven actually fits remarkably well with the theoretical New Jerusalem which John Michel had constructed based on sacred geometry and astronomy. And again, we can see here, we can put the 12 sons of Jacob with 12 signs of the Zodiac representing the positions of the various doorways. And then if we lay the grid plan on top of that, we see again how it fits with the avenues and the gates tying in with the grid of the grid plan, but also with the 12 circles on the outside representing the positions of the gates for each of the tribes, and also tying in with the signs of the Zodiac. And if we now look back at our original picture of New Jerusalem, we see that within the city itself there are kind of 12 suburbs close to the wall. I've put red dots on them here to make it clearer. These 12 suburbs would be where the 12 tribes would have had their locations. Without going into details, there was another pattern in the Old Testament of the tabernacle and the encampment of the Israelites when they originally had the Ark of the Covenant, and they put the Ark of the Covenant within the sort of middle area and they would camp out around it. And the grid plan for that is very similar to this. So here we have the positions within the walls of where the 12 tribes have their houses. And again, if we look at the positions on the grid plan, we see something like this, where we have the suburbs, the domains of the 12 tribes. And in the corners, we have the leader tribes. As I said earlier, there are 4 leading tribes, which are Reuben and Dan and Judah and Ephraim. And we can see those in the corners. And then we have the other tribes, the other 8 tribes, positioned between these, taking up the space all around the outer area here. And again, if we place that on top of the Michel New Jerusalem plan, we see something like this, where we have the 12 tribes of Israel, their settlements within the walls, laid out there, with the gates that lead into them being determined by various signs of the Zodiac, and the signs of the Zodiac linking in with the various tribes and their encampments within the walls. However, if we look closely at this diagram, we can see something else. We can see that actually within the walls themselves there is also a central area, as it were, where we've got almost like the crosshairs of a target. We've got that yellow circle in the middle, and then we got the crossing of it, and we got the smaller circle in the middle of that. That's all kind of blanked out where these 12 tribes are concerned. It's something different, clearly. If we look at it, we can see it here on this this plan of the grid, that whereas there were 12 approaches through the gates reaching the inner suburbs, to get to this inner area, there are only 4 avenues of approach, which belong, I suppose, to the 4 fixed signs of the Zodiac. The bull for Taurus, which would be Ephraim. We've got Dan, which is tied in with the not just the Scorpio, but Scorpio is also tied in with the Phoenix. So and also the serpent. When Jacob's blessing his various sons, he denotes them by certain symbols, and Dan is called the serpent in the way. And the serpent, serpens, is actually one of the subordinate constellations of Scorpio. So it does tie in there. Ephraim the bull, Judah the lion tribe, and then we've got Reuben, which is connected with Aquarius. So they make up their approach ways are these 4 directions leading into the inner area, which I've marked pink on this diagram. And then if we look at the more detailed central area of the plan itself, we see that there is this north-south, east-west crossing, but we also have, within the central area, we have a mound, like a tumulus, I suppose, in a way. And standing on that mound, we have the figure of a lamb clutching a flag. Now, for those of you who don't know this, who haven't been brought up within Christianity, the symbol of the lamb with the flag is very much associated with Easter. The lamb and flag. The lamb represents the sacrificial lamb, the paschal lamb, Paschal being Easter. The sacrificial lamb at Easter was, of course, Jesus Christ himself. And the flag that he holds, the banner, has the Christian cross on it. And it's his banner of victory. And it represents his resurrection. So we have the resurrected lamb who gave his blood for the salvation of the world, in Christian terms, symbolic of Jesus Christ. And he's standing on this mound. And you can see it more clearly here. The Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, is standing at the centre of the holy city, holding the flag with his and I was going to call it a paw. I don't know what you call it, a hoof, would you call it, with a lamb? I suppose so. And you can see this represented many times in church windows, in many different places, the symbol of the lamb and flag, representing both Easter and the resurrection and the victory of Jesus Christ over death. Now, where does this fit with Old Jerusalem? Now, I mentioned to you earlier, I think, that besides the Jews descending from Abraham, you also had his other son, Ishmael, who was the father figure of the Ishmaelites, who became the Arabs. And of course the Arabs, or the Palestinian Arabs anyway, now own the what's called the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, or the Haram Ash-Sharif. And the most important building, well, the most significant building on that site is this golden domed 8-sided structure we call the Dome of the Rock, which stands over the rock, which is supposedly the place where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son. Now, within the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's understood that the son that he was going to sacrifice was Isaac. However, if you read the Quran and if you're a Muslim, you would understand the son as being Ishmael that he was going to sacrifice. Either way, I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference. We have what's important about that story is not the identity of the son, it's the sense that Abraham was obeying God, doing God's will, when he didn't really, it was a huge sacrifice for him. So the Dome of the Rock covers over this spot, the top of Mount Moriah, and the rock itself is actually the rocky outcrop from the top of the mountain, and it's covered by the Golden Dome. Now, the Dome of the Rock itself, of course, only dates from after the Muslim invasion, which was in 632. I think the dome was built around about in the 670s. So what happened before that? Well, there's very good evidence that there was actually a Christian church originally on this site, and that the Dome of the Rock is built on the foundations of that church. Now, I don't want to go into that whole investigation, which is ongoing, and is something that's not really talked about very much anyway. But you can see that for the Jews, this was supposedly the site where Solomon's temple once stood, and there's a lot of tension in Jerusalem today between, obviously, the Muslims, this is the oldest surviving mosque, the third holiest place in Islam, very, very venerated building, and many sort of very orthodox Jews who would like to see it demolished and a new temple built in its place. And you can see those are two irreconcilable opposites and a cause of major tension. But of course for Christians as well, there's this whole idea about the New Jerusalem, the return of Jesus Christ at the end of the age, and the judgment on the world, which is all supposed to take place again on this site, which is kind of like the seat of God. So it's worth having a look at the dome itself and the surrounding area to see how much this tells us also about the concept of New Jerusalem. So I'm just going to have a little look at this now. So you bear in mind that this dome stands in a much larger enclosed area. The western side of it is this supposedly was where Herod had built his temple, but it's a much larger complex than that. The western side, with the surviving wall, the Wailing Wall as it's called, is the most holy place for the Jews, and you see them there today praying at the Wailing Wall. And of course for Muslims it's where this dome is. In the distance in this picture you can see, I think you can just about make it out, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. No, perhaps not on this one. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the eastern part of the western part of the old city is a massive church built over the site where Jesus is supposedly rose from the dead. And then behind there's the Mount of Olives, from which Jesus ascended to heaven. Or that's what it says in the Acts of the Apostles. And there's actually another mosque there, which was an old church, the Mosque of the Ascension, which again is an eight-sided structure, just like this. There's an eight-sided wall, and then there's this kind of courtyard area and a small enclosure in the middle, the equivalent of the actual centre bit of the Dome of the Rock, from marking the spot where he supposedly rose to heaven from. So there are other churches, eight-sided churches. That was one of them. There's another one at Capernaum or Capharnaum, where Peter's house stood, eight-sided church. So I think there is good evidence to suggest that this dome was built on the site of an earlier Christian church. Now, if we have a look at the overall layout of the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, so-called, you can see that it is actually, there's this large enclosed area with the dome. The space here is probably big enough for a couple of football fields. And you've got the dome there standing in the sort of upper area of it. And it is actually aligned north, south, east, west. You can see these axis lines here. And the north-south axis runs down through another mosque, which is properly speaking, is the Friday mosque, where Muslims congregate on a Friday for prayers. That's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And in the Middle Ages, after the Crusader invasion in 1099, the so-called Knights Templars, the Knights of the Poor Knights of Jesus Christ in the Holy Temple, I think that was their full title, they set up their headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And now, of course, once they were booted out again, that was reconsecrated, it became a mosque again. But there is an axis line that runs right through the Dome of the Rock, right through the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And I think I'm right in saying that Al-Aqsa means the Axis Mosque, which is, of course, on the axis, the north-south axis, which isn't actually the same axis as would run through Mecca. Mecca's not directly south from Jerusalem, but clearly this axis was already well defined long before these mosques were built. And if we look at a bit more detail at the dome of the rock itself, we can have a look at its ground plan. And here you can see it's an eight-sided building, and you can see the two axes running through the doorways. There's a doorway to the north, another to the south, east, west. And you can see there are 8 pillars around the outer part of the dome itself, and then you've got an inner part with 4 pillars. There are smaller pillars as well in both these areas, which support sort of rood screens and things. But the main pillars are these large ones that you see here marked in black. And you can see the rock within the middle area, and you can actually go underneath this rock. There's the stairs that lead underneath it, and you can look up. There's a hole that rises from within the rock, which is supposedly, it's like a chimney, I guess, supposedly where Muhammad is supposed to have risen to heaven on his heavenly beast. I don't think he's ever actually visited Jerusalem. This has all happened within his sleep, within his dream. At least that's how I understand it. So this is what makes this such a holy place for the Muslims. Now, if we have a look at, we place the grid plan on it, the grid plan of New Jerusalem again, it's remarkable the way that it fits. We can see that the positioning of the pillars is exactly defined by the grid, that the way the pillars are lined up fits the grid plan to a T. So we can say that, in a sense, this Dome of the Rock is a kind of miniature version of New Jerusalem. That seems to be the message that's contained within it. And actually, if we look at the central area of the dome, then we can see that the central four pillars are what support the dome itself. And when we were looking at the earlier pattern of the New Jerusalem, we recognized that this inner area contained the circle, which I said represents the sun level. So it's not surprising that this dome is actually golden coloured, reflecting the sunlight. It does represent, I think, the sun itself. So you've got the outer area, which would represent the earth, and it's kind of like the mesoteric area. And then you've got the domed area within, covering over the rock, on which Abraham supposedly was going to sacrifice his son. You can make your own mind up whether that's Ishmael or Isaac. And then we've got the very, very central area, which would be equivalent to this shaft running up to heaven, which again fits in with this idea that beyond the sun, beyond the solar system, is this a possibility for human beings to ascend to heaven, to go upwards, which is echoed again with the Church of the Ascension on nearby Mount of Olives, which is built to the same pattern as this, and again symbolises where Jesus supposedly rose to heaven, and there's actually a rock in there with his footprints, and you can light candles and place them next to it. So we can see that the idea of Jerusalem as the place where New Jerusalem is going to be manifested is very much connected with the architecture even of the Dome of the Rock. And the idea is that at the end of days, God himself will come to the Temple Mount and judge mankind. That's why on the slopes of the Mount of Olives there is a large graveyard, Jewish graveyard, because people believe that within the Jewish tradition that the bridge will be placed across the little Kidron Brook, which runs between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives, so dried up brook, and that the bridge will be there and people will be able to walk across for judgment on the Temple Mount, and then they will either go to heaven or not, as the case may be. So it's a very desirable place to be buried. So we can see that John Michel's plan of New Jerusalem divides the world into four groups. First of those who are outside of the city entirely. Right? So if you're outside of the city, you're in the world of the dead, the moon world. The moon, we think we're alive, we think we're leading a sort of productive lives, but unless you actually enter the path, as far as esotericism is concerned, you're dead. Go within the walls, the first level, you come to the earth level, the level of the 12 tribes. To get in there, you have to be true to your own sign of the Zodiac. So I'm a Leo, I would go through the Leo gate. If you're a Scorpio, you go through the Scorpio gate, etc. That brings you into this outer area of the New Jerusalem, the outer suburbs, as I called it. But then you can pass through that inner area itself, which is the equivalent of the dome, this golden area, and then within that, marked in black, is the area of transformation, the area of resurrection, rising to heaven, back to the Godhead, back to the Holy Trinity. And that might seem very sort of mystically nonsense to people who've grown up with the kind of Dawkins idea that there is no God, there's nothing there. You know, you're just alive while you're alive, and then you're dry bones when you're dead. But this is what the esoteric traditions of all ages have always taught, that there is this spark within us which has the possibility to go back out from the earth, out from even the sun, back up to heaven. All of which brings us to another question. If this New Jerusalem plan is, as I believe, a piece of advanced esotericism, is there any evidence of people having known about this outside of the Bible and outside of the structures that we see today in Jerusalem? In other words, is it kind of a universal tradition that's been preserved, perhaps by the Freemasons, maybe by other people, working with this plan, working with these ideas and putting them into execution? Well, I think there is. And a good place to start looking, of course, is within church buildings. And in particular, there's one church that I'd like to draw your attention to, which is the Temple Church in London. Now, this was the old preceptory, or the headquarters of the Knights Templars, who within London, within England. Obviously, they had preceptories all over Europe, but this was one of their main ones, and it was the one in London. And of course, the Knights Templars, as I was saying earlier, had actually lived on the Dome of the Rock, on the Temple Mount. So they were very familiar with the Dome of the Rock. And when they built their churches, they tended to build them round. And they were also the people that introduced the Gothic style to Europe. In fact, the Temple Church itself is a transitional building which shows some elements of the earlier Norman style, but also the Gothic, beginnings of the Gothic style. So it's one of the early buildings that we can call transitional Gothic. So it's a very important building in its own right. And it still stands today. It's in the law courts of Temple Bar, the inner and the middle temple. And this building is quite remarkable when you look at it. You know, you see here there's a round area at the western end of it, and then there's a rectangular area at the eastern end, and the altar is actually at the far east end. So this circular area is actually the older part of the building. The square area was an extension that was built during the Middle Ages. And if we overlay the circular area with our plan of New Jerusalem, we see something quite remarkable. The way that it actually fits, John Michel's plan of New Jerusalem actually fits exactly over this circular area, splitting it up. It's split into 12 anyway, and the inner area within the walls itself. You've got an earth level, as I would call it, and then you've got an inner level within that. And actually within the inner level is where there are some tombs, including the tombs of various Earls of Pembroke. So we can see here replicated in a slightly different form, because it's using six-fold geometry instead of eight-fold geometry as you have on the Temple Mount. You have got the creation of, on the ground within the temple building, you have a recreation of what's written in St. John's Revelation, the pattern of New Jerusalem. So you could say that this building is intended to be a sort of New Jerusalem for the initiates of this secretive order, the Knights Templars, whom I'm sure many of you know was closed down in 1313, I think it was, 1307 to 1313. The Pope closed down the order and they were accused of heresy. Well, they knew things which perhaps people didn't want them to know outside of the order. So that's the first example that I think is very interesting and indicates that within the medieval period, within sort of the Christian heritage, there were at least certain people within certain brotherhoods who knew about these ideas. And it's also said the Knights Templars passed on a lot of their knowledge to the Freemasons, that some of them went to Scotland and were employed by Robert the Bruce and started the whole sort of Freemasonry in Scotland tradition, which was later brought to London at the time, or re-brought to London at the time of James I. So we have got evidence that could link these Temple of Jerusalem with the Temple Church, with the revelation of the New Jerusalem being rebuilt in London. And I've written a whole book on this, as I'm sure some of you know. There's also ideas that London itself had by that time been chosen as a site to be the New Jerusalem anyway. But I want to go back even further than that. And if we look at Britain's most famous ancient monument, Neolithic monument, we see this, Stonehenge. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of Stonehenge many times, you've probably read books about it. But basically you have an outer earth, bank and ditch monument. Now there's many of those in Britain. They go back even before people started raising stones and raising stone circles. Earliest type of monument, what is called a henge monument, actually refers to the circle. And you have a ditch and bank with an entrance, and these were gathering places, sacred gathering places, that were employed by the British people during Neolithic periods. Then later they built these stone circles within, and you got an outer circuit, which is the famous one with the uprights with stones placed on top, forming a big circle around, referred to as the Giant's Dance, I think, by Geoffrey of Monmouth. And then within that you've got several other trilithons, which are very, very large uprights with lintels on top. And then you've also got circles of what are called blue stones, which are much smaller stones, which were brought to the site, we now know, from southwest Wales, from the Preseli Hills. So we have this extraordinary monument, and as everyone knows, it's aligned towards sunrise on Midsummer's Day, and it's also been pointed out that if you look the other way, it's aligned to sunrise on midwinter sunset. So we have got this extraordinary monument here with definite associations with the sky and with sunrise, but also Gerald Hopkins, I think it was, in the 1960s, carried out various analyses of the alignments of the archways within, and there's many different alignments. And he found that there were lots of other solar and lunar risings and settings also indicated by this monument, which suggested that it was some kind of astronomical temple. Well, if we take Stonehenge and again we superimpose the plan upon it, we can well, first of all, have a look at this plan here, which was part of the Petrie survey. Now, William Flinders Petrie is often referred to as the father of modern archaeology. He was the first one to really introduce rigour into the whole subject. Before that, there'd been antiquarians. They weren't really archaeologists. He was the first one to start trying to work out timelines using pottery. He went to Giza and measured the Great Pyramid with great accuracy. He also came to Stonehenge and measured this with great accuracy and drew up these plans. And this plan was published in 1877, and it's still probably the best we've got. Anyway, if you take his plan and you superimpose on it, you can see the alignment, first of all, to the sunrise on 3100 BC, the midsummer sunrise. It would have taken place when the sun was conjunct with a star called Regulus, which is in the constellation of Leo. And this suggests to me that this would have been the original stone circle, the earth bank, before the stones were built, I'm talking about here, had this alignment, which suggests to me that this was used as some sort of royal enclosure to do with the coronation of kings. The Regulus has always been the royal star par excellence, the Lionheart star. But it also indicates that we have got a marker, as it were, for at least one of our signs of the Zodiac. And then if we place the John Michel pattern on top of that, we see how the outer sarsen stones fit very, very comfortably in this outer circuit that we have here, tying in the moon positions. But you remember I said how these 12 smaller circles around the outside represented months or the moons. The pearls, they're where the gateways are. So you've got the various gateways marked very clearly on the circuit of the stones as you're going round. Quite extraordinary. So we can see what Leo would have been the midsummer sunrise gate. And then we've got the other gates going all the way round. And then we've also got in a circuit of blue stones marked out very comfortably and clearly within that smaller circle, the sun, what I call the sun circle earlier. So that would suggest that that area was intended to represent a kind of sun level, whereas the outer layer would have been, the outer level would have been the earth level. So we've got very clearly this whole idea coming through of how the Stonehenge was working as a kind of cosmic monument, a sort of earlier version of New Jerusalem. Now, if we go back to the earlier plan again, we can see how we can also lay on top of it the grid map of the New Jerusalem that we had designed before for the Holy City, which again is emphasizing this whole connection between whatever was going on in Stonehenge and the New Jerusalem plan within the book of Revelation. But this is thousands of years earlier. We've got to kick ourselves. Remember, this is, this monument was being built between around 3100 BC and perhaps around 1500 for its latest last incarnation, as it were. So we're looking at plans here which go way back, long before even the Kingdom of Israel was formed. So there seems to be something similar also going on in Britain here with Stonehenge. Now, but I want to draw your attention to something else before we leave this subject. And that is, if we go back to the earlier view of Stonehenge that we derived from this aerial shot, and you can see the outer bank. And I started thinking, well, what's this outer bank for? I mean, we've got the New Jerusalem pattern fits very nicely around just the stony bit in the middle. Why have we got the outer bank? And I saw a clue to this in another book, which is called The Canon, by William Sterling, also written in the 19th century. And if we take, first of all, Petrie's survey, we look at that again, and we can see the layout, very accurate layout that he did, even with contours drawn for the outer ditch and bank on the outside there. And then we compare it with a diagram William Sterling produces of what he calls the Holy Oblation, which is kind of like a cosmic layout based upon the positions of the planets within the solar system. And you can see here a couple of them are marked. You've got circle of Mars contained within that square. You've got the sun shown going on a circuit. You've got 4 circuits going round it, which represent the circuits of, I think it's Mercury. And then he's got the circuit of Jupiter going around as well. And then we've got the outer circuit would represent the Zodiac, the constellations, the stars outside. And he's based this on this pattern here of the universe, which is the traditional way that people would see the positions of the stars and the planets. You had the sort of planetary rings going out from the centre, and then you had marked by stars about the fourth row in. You've got these stars marking out the position of the fixed stars, which would correspond with the zodiac. And I couldn't help thinking that the pattern that we have here, and I haven't investigated this fully, but the pattern we have here somehow seems to represent this full solar system. The outer ditch and bank representing the outer cosmos, the zone of the fixed stars, while the inner area is marked by the stone circle, represents our inner solar system in some way. And what that ties in with is something else I wanted to mention. We're talking about self-transformation, resurrection, ascension. And as we mentioned with Jerusalem, there was this idea that to get to heaven you had to go up through the central chimney, from the Dome of the Rock. Remember I was saying about the stone and it had this hole through it. Muhammad is said to have risen to heaven there. The idea of Jesus rising off his rock, going to heaven up there. These represent progressively moving inwards. We move in from the circuits of the planets. We move to the circuit of the sun, the earth. We going within. And the idea is that to find heaven, you don't go out through Saturn's rings and then out through the zodiac. That won't take you there. The way to get back up to heaven is actually within, through the heart and the ascension. And that's something I'm going to cover in a later lecture, but I'll leave those thoughts with you. The whole concept of the New Jerusalem, the concepts of linking astronomy, astrology, and the layouts of certain buildings and temples ties in with the book of Revelation and what it has to say about what would be revealed at the end of the age. And as a connection, actually, what will be revealed to our inner senses, as it was to St. John. Not really a city plonked down on the Dome of the Rock, on top of the Temple Mount, but something that will be revealed within. And I'll leave that to you for now. Thank you very much.